Well, last year we were privileged to hear a lecture about the story of the college, and lots of us really appreciated that. And we've been thinking, wouldn't it be great to hear other aspects of the college's story treated in a bit more detail? And we're so grateful that Ruth has agreed to do just that, looking at a particular theme in the college's life. One of my great regrets was that Ruth chose to leave her position as tutor just as I was starting. So maybe a coincidence there, maybe not. But I never got the chance. I mean, I knew Ruth very well. I was in pastorate here while she was at the college. But I would have loved the opportunity to have been your colleague. I'm very grateful that you're here now to talk to us about this very important issue of women in ministry at Bristol Baptist College. So Ruth, thank you so much for all that you've contributed to the college over the years, for your contribution to the college history, both in person and in writing, and now for being willing to offer us this lecture. Thank you.
Sounds like I'm a historical artefact. I was just saying to Steve, he thinks he was thick. I was given a fresh shirt when I turned 60, and it was presented by people who turned up at a service I was leading, and I didn't know why they were there. These people kept coming in. I thought, this is really interesting. Why are you all here? And then the service was hijacked and this book was delivered, and it's, yeah, never felt so stupid in all my life. Anyway, my title for this paper is just lovely and broad: Women in Ministry at Bristol Baptist College. I mean, we cover everything really, wouldn't it? And I'm hoping to come at it in a variety of ways, but I want to start with my usual disclaimers. This is not definitive. There is much more work to do, and there may even be somebody here today who will go to work in the archives and find out some of the stuff that's in there that I haven't been able to uncover. And thirdly, my conclusions, such as they are very tentative. This is an exploration rather than a final statement. And I think there's something interesting going on that will benefit from somebody taking it further. So I'm here to encourage someone to take it further. I would say I've got very little to say about women who've been involved in doing the training through college, partly because I was one of them. And I think it's better for somebody else to talk about those of us who've been tutors. But that said, there is a lot to hear and to celebrate in the story of women training in this college. The records tell us that it was in 1919 that there was a decision of the College Council to accept women to train in Bristol Baptist College. Not clear what that training was to be for, because at that point there was not a union-wide agreement of the recognition of the ministry of women amongst us. But there were some women serving in churches without formal training, and it looks likely that that's the context in which the decision was made. In 1918, the church at Little Chew in Oxfordshire had called Edith Gates to be their minister, though she had done no college training at all in any of our colleges. Later on, she went to do some training at Havelock Hall, which was the Deaconess Training College. And she served in Little Chew from 1918 to 1950. So she has a long and, as far as we can tell, a very significant ministry, but almost under the radar. Nobody really says much about it. It's just there. And she started off as church secretary and and I think because of the war, kind of took on more and more of the roles. And at the end of the war, the church said, well, you are our minister. You know, but that was the kind of process. But the discussion that was held in the College Council and the decision that was taken in 1919 was that if and when a woman applied for training, the college was ready and willing to consider her and, if appropriate, to accept her. Now, it's worth noting this. One of the buzzwords in any kind of formational work, especially for those who are entering kind of context of ministry and work amongst the churches, is forward-proofing. Trying to find ways of ensuring that an institution such as this is not just doing what has always been done, or working with the insights into the context as it now is, but the importance of thinking ahead, of looking at what might happen, what needs to be in place to meet the new possibilities and the new opportunities. That is at least as important, and probably more important, as dealing with what's going on now. And we call it strategic planning. And it's important. Planning like that matters. Pray for those who are on the committees and in the meetings where that kind of thinking has to be done. Pray for their wisdom, pray for their courage, pray for their insight. Because one of the gifts of history to us is the reminder that all our strategy and all our planning is contingent and tentative. Because we don't actually know what's going to happen. And we can't actually plan to meet it fully and without gaps. And I will come back to that in a moment. But we can plan. And we do take decisions that are new and bold and open up possibilities. And that's what the college did in 1919. Now, as it happens, the first woman who applied to study formally for recognition within our structures as Baptist minister went to another place. But in 1937, Gwyneth Hubble came to train in Bristol. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about Gwyneth Hubble later on today, and I will say a little bit more about her. It's not straightforward to trace her life in college. She and several men were accepted at the same time. Her name does not appear in the way that theirs do in the following years in the records. However, we do know that she graduated with a BD in 1939, and then again, there's a difference in the records. Several men graduated at the same time. One of them, Norman Moon, went on to become a tutor here and to write a history of the college, really important one, worth reading. And his movements on his graduation were recorded, and another student who graduated at the same time, Robert Thompson, he'd come from Australia to train in Bristol, and he went back to Australia to a pastorate. That's all written up in the records. Nothing is recorded of Gwyneth's movement immediately leaving after college. And I suspect that's because she couldn't settle. There was nothing to see. But that wasn't, there was just no way of putting it in. But nor in Norman's book, he does say, after ordination, she served with the student Christian movement. And she then became principal of Carey Hall College in Selly Oak, which was for the training of free church women who were going to serve overseas. And then in 1961 to 1968, she served the World Council of Churches as part of the World Mission, the Division of World Mission. She worked in New York and later in Canada, and when she retired, she stayed in Canada. Now, she is an amazing woman, Gwyneth Hubble. Not enough is told of her story, and today is really not the place to do it, though it does need to be done. She will turn up again in this story, indirectly. The fact that she trained at Bristol turns out to be important for other women who came in the future. And some of her discussion about women and ministry, and in particular about Baptists and women and ministry, raised some important questions that I think still need addressing. We will return to her, but in the meantime to notice some other women who were part of the community training. 1945, Joan Cole came. She was sent by BMS. She finished her BA and then went and settled in Wiltshire, which isn't a well-known BMS mission station. So I think there was family issues that, in fact, she couldn't go and serve overseas. She had to stay home to care for family. But she taught in a school near Melksham, and she taught divinity. That was one of her subjects, though. That was where her training led her. There were also one or two other women in the 1950s attending as external students. So they would come in, as far as I can tell, they came in for certain parts of the course, certain lectures. All of them working towards a BD for various reasons, though notably none of them for ministry. They were going on to teach, or they were going on to work in something like, as Gwyneth Hubble had done in the student Christian movement or so on, so in Christian organisations, but they weren't training for ministry. And that reflects life within our union. Project Violet has helped us quite rightly celebrate the centenary of Violet Hedger, who was the first woman to train at a college 100 years ago. But just because she did that hasn't meant that we had a steady flow of women since then coming into ministry. After Hedger, Hubble was next. And in an article that she wrote in 1960 called Women in the Ministry, which was published in the Baptist Ministers' Journal, what was then called the Fraternal, which tells you all you need to know, really. But she commented in 1960 that in the 21 years since I was ordained, no other woman has been. So there was this huge gap. And part of the reason for that, as Hubble says, is that there was the order of deaconesses. And again, a story told in various places, but often not well known. But Bristol does have a place in that story, so we'll pick it up in a moment. But before we look at the connection between Bristol College and the Deaconess Order, just say a little bit about the deaconesses, because have you heard of the deaconesses? Good, because usually when I ask that question they go, are they the women who were elected to the diaconate? No, deaconesses are something different. So I'm really pleased that you have heard about it, because this is a story that's told and not heard in some places. But it has a huge impact on the questions around issues of women and ministry. The deaconess movement among Baptists is part of a wider move in the late 19th century. It sees women getting involved in church structures in a new way. Part of the origin was the Oxford movement amongst the Anglicans, retrieving for Anglican churches some aspects of life that have been lost sight of really since the Reformation, and one of those was this concept of a dedicated order of women, not exactly nuns, but living together in the service of the church and the community, and they were the deaconesses, the Anglican deaconesses. And the movement spreads beyond Anglicanism, and the various other impetuses becomes very important in continental Europe. In the UK, in London, Dr. Meyer, who was the minister of Regent's Park Chapel, organised a movement of women living together to serve, particularly in the slums, from 1890. They were nurses, they were social workers, they were teachers, they were encouragers, they were evangelists, they were whatever they needed to be in order to meet the need that was in front of them. More of the story to tell, and a fascinating and important story. And it is around, you can find it. I'm really pleased to know about it. But the movement grew and changed and expanded from being just slum mission, although that stayed really important, but also moved out into serving in local churches. In 1919, it was formally taken into the structures of the Baptist Union and started formal training. Up until then, it had been living alongside and kind of apprenticeship model. And the training took place in various locations and forms over the years. It moved around. There was a variety of names of college. So there was Struan, there was Havelock Hall, so it's usually named after the building. In the mid-1950s, the deaconess training was taken into Carey Hall, which, as they say, existed as this kind of mission training centre. And Gwyneth Hubble was principal. By the mid-60s, the changes being made in training for those who were going to go overseas meant that the facility to train deaconesses there was no longer so readily available. And there was a lot of heart searching over what to do. And one obvious solution seemed to be to ask the existing colleges to accept the deaconesses to train there. And there was another impetus for this as well. In a survey of deaconesses themselves, it had become clear that many of them, because in many ways they were now serving as pastors, they were the minister in the local church, especially in small or in newly formed congregations, they thought that they needed training more similar to training for what they would call standard ministry, particularly in theology and in preaching skills. I worked alongside, I was mentored and tutored and helped by a woman who was eventually called the last deaconess standing, because all she ever wanted to be was a deaconess, but as we'll hear, the deaconess order comes to an end. But she was one of the best preachers I have ever heard. She would simply stand and talk, and she was just amazing. But she constantly said, and she only retired, when did she retire? Early 2000s, retired from ministry. But she constantly said, I can't preach, I wasn't trained. And she'd been to Carey Hall. She'd been one of the last students at Carey Hall. And that was the sense that they needed more training. So, to come back to our story of women in this college, this is one of the significant moments. Bristol, possibly because of the links with Gwyneth Hubble, though she had moved on, possibly because of the attitude of the then principal, Bristol became the place where the deaconesses came to train. There were already links there. Several women had come to do what they called refresher courses, which were somewhere like sabbatical studies. It was one of the ways in which the order cared for its members. When life got too much, and sometimes it did, they were given the opportunity of a refresher course and some time at college and some time to reflect and be taught and be cared for. And that had happened at Bristol. It was one of the places where the students came. And in addition, a young woman who was a member of Horfield and who was seeking to discern her future began to attend the college as a part-time student, what we'd now call church-based. She was working in the congregation at Horfield, and she was coming to college for lectures, and this was Carol McCarthy. And what's significant in Carol's story, and for this approach, is that she wasn't sure whether she was being called to be a minister or a deaconess. but she wanted the theological and pastoral training in order to be formed for one or the other. So she came to college. 1967, there was the formal decision that Bristol would be the place where deaconesses were to be trained. And over the next few years, several women came explicitly as deaconess students. Over those years, the minutes of the Deaconess Committee record that 9 women came to Bristol to train. And in 1969, a Miss Townsend, a retired nursing sister who lived in Bristol, was appointed by the college as a tutor with particular care for the deaconesses. Her appointment caused some concern because it was made without any reference to the Deaconess Committee. But that was the executive body of the order and was made up of representatives from the deaconesses and from the union, and Harry Moveley, who was one of the tutors in the college, was also part of it to represent the college. But the college went ahead and made this appointment without talking to the committee, which was slightly awkward because actually she was being paid by the Baptist Union. So the college merrily said, well, yes, we'll employ her, and someone else will pay, and someone else had no say in it. But she was appointed and cared for these women as a kind of separate cohort. And the course that they followed was a matter of some concern and was discussed in various committees. What were they being trained for? And it's that concern and the way it was expressed that I think uncovers something really important that we still need to work at in this story. But just finish part of the story. In 1970, it was decided to cease recruitment to the Deaconess Order. There had been, in the late 60s, a report from the Baptist Union on called Ministry, and a report on ministry, and there was also a report called Women in the Service of the Church, of the denomination. And both of them made it clear that this dual track of minister and deaconess was no longer tenable, because some of the women who were wanting to be ministers and were being encouraged to be deaconesses, and some who wanted to be deaconesses were wanting, and it just was getting very messy. But what it meant and what happened is probably a story for another place, what happened to the women who were deaconesses. But the significant thing is that in 1975, the order was closed. And all those who were deaconesses were told to contact their regional ministers and get themselves ordained as ministers. There was no further discernment process. The idea was if you'd been called as a deaconess, you were clearly a minister. And for some of them, that wasn't the case. As I say, Barbara that I worked with, all she ever was, wanting to be, understood herself to be, was a deaconess. And I say all she ever, deaconesses are amazing. Some of them left the order, some of them retired, some of them, many of them, did become ministers. I've just been given a deaconess badge. If you haven't seen it, come and have a look. They're not common because, of course, the deaconesses kept them when they retired, and they often got thrown out, I think, when people died. So this is the deaconess badge is just here. But 1975, they ceased. And for those who were studying in college, actually, the decision had often been made earlier. So Carol McCarthy chose during her training to candidate for ministry and was accepted. And she went on to a long, faithful ministry amongst our churches, as did several others who had come in that way, uncertain about what they were going to do, but moved into ministry. And the other impact, therefore, was that more women were training for ministry, and several of them came to Bristol. It gradually builds up through the 70s and into the 80s. Names of those who are still our ministers begin to appear in the college records in the mid-70s. Names you'll know, like Ruth Bottoms, who chaired council. So there are people in the others who are significantly part of our common life. By the time I came to teach here in the mid-1990s, I followed Hazel Sherman, who'd been appointed in the mid-80s. The presence of women in the college, though still a minority, was by no means commented on as something unusual. Proportionately, though this is impressionistic, I haven't managed to do all the research on this, proportionately, we've had fewer women than Northern Baptist College, but we've had more than Spurgeon's. Figures for Regent's Park are so differently configured, it's hard to compare. But Bristol has had this significant impact during the last few years of deaconess recruitment, and that was then important, as it were, for establishing a pattern of recognising and encouraging women to be part of the college, part of the developing patterns of ministry in the denomination. There was already this sense that women were part of the college because of what the deaconess presence. And the development of different kinds of courses, moving away from a pattern of 3-year residential training, for example. It's significant in this. It makes other possibilities available, and itself is driven by the needs of those who are applying. It's also driven, of course, by the churches that are sending us. And the new shape of the course, it looks very different even from when I came to teach, and certainly very different from what it was like in the 70s and 80s. The new shape of the course reflects new patterns of ministry among us. What we might recognise as a classic pastoral ministry, but youth-focused ministry, pioneer ministry, team ministry, bivocational ministry, you name it, we can do it. And part of that is a response to people coming from different contexts and asking different questions. And it's that changing pattern I want to think about. I was asked recently in what ways I believed or indeed had seen ministry and ministerial identity change as women have become more visible and present. And I'm not sure I can answer it. I think somehow we'll actually only answer it in about a century or so. I'm enough of a historian, you know. That's modern studies, I can't do that. Give me another 100 years. But I think there is something to say. There has been, since 1919, a significant amount of reflection on what it means, or rather what it might mean, what it could mean, if women were accepted into the college and became part of the ministry. And two people connected with this college in particular wrote significant pieces in the middle of the last century that directly relate to this. The first is Gwyneth Hubble. In 1960, she wrote this article in the Fraternal called Women in the Ministry. And in that, she addressed directly the issue that the denomination had reflected and reported on the mid-1920s in such a way as to affirm the ministry of women, but it hadn't happened. And that's when she comments that there are only two other women. She was, since her ordination, there were only 3 of them on the list, and the other 2 were retired. It was Edith Gates and Violet Hedger. Now, it's a very detailed and on the whole a very positive article about her experience of being a woman in ministry, but she does face this question head on. And why is it not happening? Why are there not more women coming? And one of the significant reasons she suggests for the number of women not rising, apart from the inherent conservatism of the churches, which she says is very real and should be challenged, but she said it is the existence of the deaconess order. Now, it's not that she was not a supporter of the deaconess order. She trained deaconesses for many years. But she said the choices before Baptist women was whether to choose between pushing her way into the ministry or offering to the deaconess committee, which, if she had the necessary qualifications, would receive her with open arms. Had the Baptists not had deaconesses, would a number of women have become Baptist ministers? Now, Nicola Morris has written really helpful history of the deaconess order. It's called Sisters of the People. And it's part of an MA project. And one of the things she did was survey the deaconesses who were still, still alive, clearly, when she wrote this in the early 2000s. And one of the questions she asked was, why did you become a deaconess? And one of them said, I had no choice. I was not aware that Baptists had any women ministers until I studied church history at college. This is anonymised, so we don't know which college she was at. If I'd been given the choice, I would have chosen to train for ordained ministry at the outset. And this is someone alive in 2000. I don't know who it was, because I say it's anonymised, but we can assume that she started her training at a time when there were women in ministry, but she hadn't heard about it. Apart from anything else, it is a witness to knowing your history. Okay? She hadn't heard about it, so she didn't know it was a possibility, so she became a deaconess. I did not know that Baptist women had ministers, or Baptists had women ministers. And Hubble's argument is particularly pointed because, as she went on to explain, many of the deaconesses were in effect in sole pastoral charge, and they were functioning as ministers on less pay, with less training, without the recognition that would offer certain kinds of support. Though it is worth noting that the deaconess order was such a strong sense of community, and remains actually for retired deaconesses a very strong sense of community. The mutuality and the care taken through the committee meetings and so on, significant part of the reality, and something that, again, is worth reflecting on, the support that it offers to people in these kind of works. But what Hubble points out is that although the denominations and the colleges on the whole had taken the decisions that women were to be trained and recognised as the same way as men for ministry, what was actually happening was what she called an escape route, because the deaconess order was on offer. But an escape route from what? Well, I think from 2 things. One sort of slightly abstract thing, and that's the anchoring of a decision made in principle into concrete reality. Women were in principle accepted on the same basis as men for ministry, but it was barely tested and barely tried out because the deaconess order absorbed women who might have become ministers. And so the abstract decision could remain a nice decision that we've taken and we don't actually have to do anything about. And secondly, it avoided any thinking about this question that I was asked. Does it change our understanding and our practice of ministry if women are accepted on the same basis and for the same roles as men? The role of deaconess, in principle, was very clearly defined and accepted. The fact that it changed is but the role was clearly defined and accepted, and it was one that fitted an understanding of gender and churches and relationships and so on that people were comfortable with. The fact that in practice many of the deaconesses were acting as what we would call ministers was easily overlooked or ignored. That was just an exception. The reality, the principle is this, especially as, in particular for those women who were effectively church planters, they often left once the congregation was established and could, as somebody put one of the deaconesses put it to me once in an interview, once the church was established, they could call a proper minister, who then went on to dismantle all the community work she had built up. She was not bitter, but she was very sad. Anyway, but this idea of an escape route that Hubble outlines meant that some tough conversations and actions about what it meant to accept women into the colleges and into ministry could be sidestepped. Now hold that thought for a minute, because the other significant writing connected with this college from that period is an article by Dr. Champion, who was principal. In 1964, he wrote an article called The Ministerial Service of Women for the Baptist Quarterly. And in this, and he wrote it just before the deaconesses came to start training here, he reviews the biblical issues and the history of women's service, and he's very much in favour of women's ministry, and he goes on to say this. This brings us to some practical considerations. I want to suggest that where this concept of a complementary ministry, please, this is not complementarianism. I realised when I was reading it through this morning, that is a concept that was not around. Okay, but a complementary ministry, so a partnership ministry, is accepted. Then 3 results follow. Men and women would share the basic theological training for ministry and the same opportunities for reading for a university degree. Secondly, men and women should be given at least 12 months further training after the basic theological course to offer a variety according to the function of which the individual is likely to fulfill in ministry. And then 3, and you must hear this in its context, men and women should receive the same ordination, be given the same status and the same stipend. Now, the equal pay, this is 6 years before the Equal Pay Act comes into force. Okay? So here's Dr. Champion arguing for, and deaconesses, one of the reasons churches called deaconesses was they were cheaper. Deaconesses were paid significantly less. I should like to think that these 3 statements will meet with serious attention and they might be put into effect in our denominational organisation. But, he says, this will involve us in some changing about our thinking about the ministry. For the argument I am developing rests upon the acceptance of a corporate ministry in place of an individual ministry. And his argument then continues, and he argues that where there are several churches in a town, there should be a sharing of ministry and a development of a team. And he concludes this way: in such a team or fellowship of ministers, it would be easy and advantageous for at least one to be a woman. Such a corporate ministry could offer a more comprehensive and effective service to the churches and in the name of the church. From such a ministerial fellowship, each minister, especially an unmarried minister, would find strength and an answer to problems of loneliness or depression. In this corporate manner, a ministry is exercised. If we are bold enough to think along these lines, I believe our church life would be enriched and all our ministry be more effective. Within such a ministry, I can see an acceptable place for the ministerial service as women. Such a place, I hope they will be able to occupy. And it's a fascinating reflection, as he says. It's radical at the time when one-man ministry was the norm. And it suggests something that he understands to be bold and exciting, and it is in many ways. It's also what the deaconesses were doing. The ones who were not in pastoral charge, the normal practice of the deaconesses was to work as part of a team, fulfilling the kind of roles he's talking about. That aside, for although you may not have noticed it, this isn't actually a lecture about deaconesses. But it is really interesting to read that up against the records of a discussion that's been going on for several years about the training of the deaconesses. 1954, the Deaconess College was in difficulties, and there was a lot of discussion and reflection about how to carry on training them. In the end, this was when they moved to Carey Hall. But before that, there had been an investigation into the possibility of deaconesses training at one of the ministerial colleges. And the minutes report this. Confidential approaches were made to the principals of the colleges, and Dr. Champion was principal here at that point. It's 10 years before that article, but he was principal here. Confidential approaches to ascertain whether they thought it possible for arrangements to be made whereby A, deaconess candidates could be trained as residential students, or B, deaconess candidates could be given tuition at the college while residing in a neighbouring hostel under the supervision of a warden. The principals were sympathetic and gave helpful suggestions in the ensuing correspondence. But it became clear there was little possibility of any affiliated college receiving deaconess candidates as residential students at the present time. This is 1954. This is 35 years after this college had agreed to accept women. The principals, however, held out the hope that arrangements might be made to give tuition to such candidates, provided they were resident in a separate hostel and were capable of benefiting from the classes already arranged. Now let's leave the question of accommodation aside. 35 years after they'd agreed to accept women into the college, I've yet to find out where Hubble stayed when she trained. Do we know? No. But I want to focus on that last phrase. If they are capable of benefiting from the classes already arranged. I have very deliberately, on the way through this lecture, spoken in terms of women being accepted into college and ministry. And I've used that term because it's the common one we use. But also because I think it hides a wealth of assumptions that we might want to unpack and which I think Hubble is beginning to address in her article. What does being accepted mean? If I accept something from you at a very simplistic level, I open my hands, you put something into it, you pass it on to me. I have just accepted this deaconess badge, it was given to me. I close my hands and I possess it, I own. I have whatever it is. I'm altered by the fact of accepting it, but I also remain in control. I have done it. You cannot make me accept what I do not want to take. I have accepted it. I also have the power to put it down and walk away. Please make sure I don't. I remain the one with the power here, and that which is given or accepted remains subject to my decision. When we are talking about institution and organisation, and we talk about accepting, what is going on? Who is doing the accepting? What does accepting mean? Benefit from the classes already arranged is a pragmatic solution when communities are small and resources are limited and time is short. But it's also, yes, you can come in, but you come in on our terms, to our way of being, and you change nothing. And I wonder if the reason why I couldn't easily answer the question about the impact of women on our understanding and practice of ministry and so on is not only because I'm too much of a historian to do it this recently, but also because the resilience, the homeostasis of the institutions and the institution is such that there actually hasn't been a lot of impact. There has been absorption. Now, I'm not saying there have not been changes. Women coming to the colleges, women being ministers, are not simply following patterns that already existed. They don't have to be exactly what, when, where, or are. Clearly, just to take college, there are differences. There's the changing patterns of formation. Some of that, not all of it, but some of that has been prompted by seeking to serve men and women in appropriate ways. There are practical differences. When I started training in another place, there were men's loos on every floor. There was one ladies in the basement. That's different now. Now, trivial, but it's also symbolic. You know, when I was there, we were weird. Now it's normal. When Gwyneth Hubble, Violet Hedger and Edith Gates were first listed in the handbook, which listed all those accredited for ministry, with details where they were, so on, where they trained. The women, to start with, they were listed separately as women pastors up until 1956. Then they were listed as women ministers in a separate list until 1966. It wasn't until then that there was one list. And now, wherever there's a list, because we no longer have a handbook, but any list that we have, we're all listed together. So there have been changes. But this question still niggles for me. We still celebrate women being accepted into the colleges and into ministry. And that still leaves the power with those, or with the institution, because it's not personal, with the institution that does the accepting. And that's one of those things that a friend of mine says, makes you go, Some of you may know I first wrote and talked about women in a Whitley lecture in 1997. And in that I argued that I thought and hoped that as women became more and more present in ministry and therefore in our colleges, things would change because there are different things that shape women as we grow up, develop our presence, develop our identity. We still live with different expectations. Clothing tells little boys to be awesome, tells little girls to be sweet. Toys for boys are constructions and dinosaurs. For girls, they're glittery unicorns. Paul Fittis aside. I don't have children. Those are results from 2-minute scan of Amazon. It's just there. And my expectation when I wrote the Whitley lecture was that because women were shaped by different social forces, we would bring different things to ministry. Not the nurture as opposed to teaching and childcare trope, but just an awareness that was attuned in different ways because of different world experience, and that would reshape ministry and how we did it. And maybe it has. But I am much less convinced about that than I was in 1997. It seems to me that the assumptions shaped by ethnicity and class and educational level and so on are much more significant in ironing out the differences between men and women in ministry than gender is in offering diversity. So I guess what I'm saying, as one to whom it has probably happened, is that it is very easy to be absorbed, to be accepted into something, a thing that comes as an institution and a movement, rather than to come into an institution and a movement and radically disrupt it or change it. Institutions and movements have an inbuilt resiliency. They will retain a basic shape and they will integrate new elements much more easily than change fundamentally. And that leads me to two further reflections with which I will end. Firstly, I referred very briefly to the importance of knowing history as opening possibilities for the future, particularly with reference to the deaconess who would have trained for ministry if she'd known she could. One of the things I've noticed as I've investigated the stories of women in ministry and by extension in training is the repetition of stories which seem not to be known however often they are told. I've dealt with this elsewhere if anyone wants to follow up, but just to take one of our own homegrown examples, Carol McCarthy, who trained here, wrote an article in 1986 called Ordained and Female. And in it she wrote of her frustration at the ways in which, as a woman who's a minister, she is treated by her colleagues and by the wider community. She writes about eventually accepting that she was angry and ceasing to try to push that away. She says, and this was in the Baptist Quarterly, "When I examine this anger, I find it strong and deep. I'm tired of being patronised and I'm tired of surprising people. I'm tired of being treated as a peculiarity in churches and in banks, in shops and anywhere I cash a cheque." Dates it, doesn't it? I'm tired of the way the conversation stops when I, and she puts this in inverted commas, when I admit to being a minister. And I have grown out of the phase when I added, "But don't let it worry you, I'm quite normal." And in truth, I'm angry and disappointed sometimes when men cannot cope. Now, Carol, I am proud to name as one of my wonderful mentors, not least because she gave one of the best responses I have ever heard to the challenges that women in ministry still know. And she quotes it in this article. "I don't believe in women ministers," said a stranger once, facing me squarely and standing too close. "I'm afraid you're confronted with reality," I replied. Wonderful, isn't it? 40 years before, Violet Hedger wrote this. "A vicar who was ready enough to come to my anniversary tea but would not come to the service excused himself by saying he was not sure Paul would have been there had he been invited. Or, as so often happens in a Portsmouth church after a service and a long time answering those who were asking about the way of life, the life of faith, a youth demanded pugnaciously, 'What right do you have to preach?' 'Oh, Paul, Paul, what prejudices are laid to thy charge. Often I hear murmurings that women cannot do things properly, even if they've never had the chance to try. We are so made that we fear the strange, and this is especially true of religious practices when they are different from the usual custom. It is so easy to overlook the fact that there are greater differences between the ministries of the types of men than between my ministry and some of my brethren." So we have Carol in 1986 writing of her anger at being weird. We have Violet 40 years before that writing of a similar experience. And in 2018, Lee Greenwood wrote this, so 40 years later. "I completed and shared a piece of research for my MA looking at how the history and principles of the Baptist Union of Great Britain have shaped the experience of women in ministry in its churches. And as part of that study, I invited women currently or formerly serving as Baptist ministers in Great Britain to reflect on their experiences. I wrote the questionnaire early in the project, and so it wasn't until I had already shared it that I realised I was asking the almost identical set of questions posed by Diane Tidwell 3 decades earlier, so just 10 years after Carol wrote. As I watched the responses come in, my heart sank to see that the answers were almost identical, reporting the same instances of exclusion and discrimination. Now, it's not the exclusion and discrimination I want to focus on, it's the fact we are telling the same story. There is something in the way that we tell our history that means that some stories, although they are regularly told, don't get heard. And I wonder if this has to do with being accepted into, rather than something else. That somehow being accepted implies and enforces being acceptable, fitting in with the course already on offer, as it was phrased in the 1950s. But much deeper and wider than that, telling the stories that fit the bigger normative stories. We are proud of the fact we have had women ministers for over 100 years. So we don't get to hear the stories about how difficult it's been for some of the women, and continues to be. Even when we tell the stories that women are present alongside men and it's all good, even when we know it's not, and when we say it's not, but it's not heard. So the stories that are selling the difficult bit are treated as exceptional, rather than as an embedded part of the history. And secondly, and this is what makes me hopeful, for all our planning, things happen. I spoke right at the beginning about the insight and the foresight of the College Council in 1919 in deciding to accept women, which I think it's fair to say was not a foregone conclusion nor a necessary decision. Other places didn't take it in the same way at the same time. We were the first college to do it. I think in reading Dr. Champion's article, we see somebody who is thinking hard and prayerfully about how best to serve the churches and serve those who are called to ministry in them in a context that's changing and uncertain, as it always is. And that decision and that article and all the things around them that led to them and that flowed from them are part of what has brought us here today. Of course, here today, as we are, as you are, the shape of the college, the kind of ministries represented, the people we are, the people we serve, those are not at all what that decision and that article envisaged. They did not know what we would look like, and they'd probably be fairly surprised. And we don't know what the next 10 or 20 or 100 years will look like. Of course we don't, I'm hard to say anything revolutionary in that. One of the common phrases I have heard used, I have used myself, and I'm sure you will have said it, and will say it, they didn't teach me how to do this in college. And sometimes it's frustration, and occasionally it's humorous. And it's always because we are in and we are trying to best respond to a situation nobody had thought of. Whether it's a global pandemic, or responding to huge numbers of refugees and the complex social and political implications of that, or issues of AI, and what that does to life and community, to preaching, and to being human. I love it. Now, of course, we have to... You see, we don't know what's going to happen. They didn't teach us this. I never got taught this stuff in college. I've been in ministry 30 odd years. I've never yet managed to get it right on any occasion. We plan and we set our strategies. And since I'm here to reflect on issues around women in college, that may mean asking some questions about the way in which the story of being Baptist is explored, the way in which being accepted might not be enough. There might need to be some thinking about what that means and things that need to be challenged. But that is always in the context of recognising that God does stuff in ways we didn't expect. And it might have looked obvious that what was needed to support women coming into ministry was what Dr. Champion suggested, creating teams and offering plural ministry. But what actually happened is this, is women serving in all sorts of contexts, in all sorts of ways, as women, not as supplementary men. Now, I'm not saying it's all great. You know, we're still telling the same stories, and some of them are not being heard, and some of them are bad. But I do want to rest in and reassure us all of the promise that God is at work and even our mistakes and our limited vision and our assumptions that mean we can't see beyond certain convictions won't stop God. After all, if Jesus is raised from the dead, resurrection is a fact. And one of the things that means is that however badly we get it wrong and kill it off, God will still fulfill God's loving intention for life and renewal. And that is our hope. Thank you.
I'd like to offer my thanks to Ruth for a stimulating and challenging paper which I was fortunate enough to receive in advance and have a chance to digest. And I thought it managed to be both inspiring and challenging, inviting us to respect and honour those women pioneers who went before us, but also offering a sobering glimpse of a reality which is not yet wholly equitable. And I offer a brief response as a former student of this college and now a tutor, sharing in the responsibility for the formation of our ministers, male and female. I came to the college in 2008, although I had the privilege of living in the college when I was a medical student in the late 80s and 90s back in the old Woodland Road building. At present, we have 26 ministerial students spread across the Bristol site and the Exeter hub. And of those, 12 are female. Within the bounds of statistical variation, I think we can say that we have achieved parity, and in fact we have been there for some time. Of course, our cohort of ministerial students, or female ministerial students, is not entirely in our hands, or our recruitment of them is not entirely in our hands. It's determined by a number of factors, from the way that local churches respond to an initial exploration of call, to the ways that regional ministers encourage or discourage, and ministerial recognitions committees evaluate that call. Nonetheless, we are proud that we train women and men for ministry in approximately equal proportions. Alongside our ministry students, we also train independent theological students at every level up to doctoral, and women are well represented within all of those cohorts too. Alongside their academic studies and ministerial formation programme, our current ministerial students are working in a variety of contexts. Several of them are working in pioneering situations, while others are in sole or shared pastoral charge of a more traditional church. We have students working in children's, youth and families work and in chaplaincy. Women are represented in all of those categories. And our women also demonstrate the full range of gifting. We have women who are highly gifted in listening and pastoral skills, and women who are exceptional teachers and theological thinkers. Those of you who watched the Fuelcast video series released over Lent will have seen extraordinary prophetic gifts at work, often expressed through spoken word poetry. Some of our female students are breaking entirely new ground in the pioneering contexts and church placements in which they serve, in ways that might be referred to as apostolic. And of course, running through everything that we teach and that our students do is the imperative to mission, expressed through the evangelistic gifting of many of our students. Now, none of this, of course, is to say that our male students lack these gifts, but simply to point out that even among our relatively small student cohort, God's gifts for his church are fully expressed in both sexes. Women who leave the college formed and commended for Baptist ministry go on to serve in a wide variety of contexts, and of course some of you are in the congregation today, or in the room today. Many of our women alumni, and alumni in the female is AE at the end, I checked. Many of our women alumni are leading churches in various parts of the country. Some are working in children's, youth and families ministry, some are working overseas. Our alumni are working in a variety of pioneering contexts, on housing estates and in rural areas. Bristol alumni are working in prison, hospital and school chaplaincy, as regional ministers and as theological educators. One Bristol alumna has served as president of the Baptist Union of Great Britain and as president of the European Baptist Association. But there are still ongoing difficulties and struggles. Not every church is encouraging to those women who first sense the stirrings of God's call. Not every church will consider appointing a woman when they are seeking to call a new minister. Our anecdotal impression is that single women still find it harder to settle in the technical sense of the word, you understand, and that there is still stereotyping that women will serve in certain forms of ministries, such as children's or pastoral, rather than in others, such as team leading or teaching. Some work done recently by one of our gifted alumni demonstrated a significant stipend gap between men and women. And we're very grateful for the ongoing work of Project Violet. That's because I talk about violence too often. Which is seeking to understand and address some of these experiences. And we should keep all this in context, of course. I recently spent time with a group of Baptist women from Eastern Europe, many of whom demonstrated enormous gifting and had a clear sense of God's call upon their own lives. And none of those women was free to follow that call fully. And each of them had significant and sometimes highly restrictive boundaries placed around the ways in which they were permitted to serve in their own home contexts. Many of you will be aware that there is a strong trend within the United States called the Movement for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and I use that phrase in scare quotes, which seeks to place huge restrictions around the ways in which women operate, not only in churches, but also in wider society and in homes. The movement is highly influential in large parts of American evangelicalism and is beginning to have impact in parts of the British Church. We need to be aware of the threat that it could exercise to the service of women in this country. But we at Bristol Baptist College are proud to train women as well as men for Baptist ministry. And we do it not because we should, and I quote, keep up with the times, but because we are deeply convinced that Scripture testifies to God's equal call placed upon women and men, and that when women are prevented from being obedient to that call, it is the whole church which loses out. And so we work actively, not passively, to facilitate and encourage the callings of our female students. When we interview prospective students, we check with the male applicants that they will be an encouraging and affirming presence for the women they will be studying alongside. We offer a highly flexible training programme, which would benefit, I hope, to all our students, but especially for some women who have particular constraints around their time or geographic availability. We have both women and men on our tutorial staff, women to model female leadership and men to champion it. And here's an example. A few months ago, we had several sessions looking at the biblical evidence that God calls women to ministry. And I'm going to quote from Steve's talk on the New Testament. And he says this: "The writers of the New Testament understand that the life and the death and the resurrection and the ascension and the sending of the Spirit shows that God is initiating the process through which God is going to fulfill all his ancient promises. This is God's program. At Pentecost, it falls to Peter to explain what God is up to, and he quotes the prophet Joel. Now the Spirit is given to all humanity, including both men and women. And the manifestation of the Spirit is that they should prophesy. All of these categories of people speak the word of God. The program is clear." In both the Old and the New Testament, Scripture tells of many remarkable women whom God called to lead and teach his people. The call continues today, and many remarkable women are responding. We at Bristol Baptist College are committed to continuing and to do our part in facilitating that.
Well, thank you so much, Helen, for your response, and again, Ruth, for what you have brought to us. We have about 10 minutes, and that's not a long time, but maybe it is an important time where we can capture something of responses in the room to things that you have heard both speakers present this morning, to be as the body of Christ together, just hearing each other, questions that need to be posed. I've certainly been here in a few places in the gut here. Particularly interesting, I'll mention it now, how we teach our Baptist history programme, because how the stories of women are told through the 10-week module and so on. So there's work to be done there, and I take that and we'll work to it. Please do. This is a conversation, and then it's over to you. There is a mic that will be available.
Can I just say, as one who was responsible for the Baptist history programme for a scarily long time, that's me I'm getting at. I didn't do it the way I should have done.
No.
So don't worry about it.
Let's talk on
Let's
this
get it
briefly,
right.
because, I mean, for those who maybe it's so long ago you can't even remember your Baptist history and principles lectures, but the way that... there are just... the way the module is framed over 10 weeks is like week 8, we look at women in ministry and the journey. And I guess that's been how it's been framed at many of the colleges. But there are other stories that could be told, is the point, aren't there? From
Yes.
early...
From earlier on, there are women doing I mean, Broadmead, Dorothy Hazard, setting up, leaving her Anglican vicar husband's church in order to... we've got those stories, and we need to be telling them. Yeah. And I think this is always a problem. Having a session that deals with women still keeps it as something apart. Yeah, so done it too.
Now, Ruth, hang around if you would. Helen, come and join me as well, then we can keep the conversation flowing from the front. There's a mic. Tommy is the holder of the mic, the power, all right? So please indicate if you'd like to speak. We'll be strict about time because lunch has arrived and we will stop. Anybody like... Yes, please, Denise. Tommy, come if you would. Wave your hand, Denise, just so you can see where... Shout, Denise, if not, we'll repeat the question.
Thank you. That's loud enough, I think. Very loud. Tim, one of the essays that we had to write, and it's the one I misspelled, was assess the role of Baptist women in the last 400 years of Baptist history. Was one of the essay options in your module on Baptist history. And I did write that, although I did write asses, the role of women, but I didn't mean to. It was quite funny. But I just wondered, was that predominantly chosen by women to write about? And did many men write that essay? And you may not have those figures to hand, but I just wonder, is that something that men were even interested in? Because I find that quite often, we had a symposium in Heber on International Women's Day about women in ministry, and a lot of men, even men married to women who were both in ministry, said, I thought that was just for women to turn up to. I didn't think it was, and we sold it as though it was about practical theology. We had Project Violet speaking at it, and I spoke about how this was come along to it. It's about learning about practical theology, but people said, that's a women's issue. It's for women to talk about. So I just wonder if that's something...
I think there's a good challenge in your question. I cannot remember the actual points of that.
They're anonymised.
They're all anonymous, of course. But I am aware, particularly your group, but every year, it's the women in the classroom who really react positively to that whole area being discussed, but also are quick to critique that we have reduced it and we need to expand it. Thank you. Martin.
Just thank you very much for both of your contributions. Just as an echo there, and this is apologetically tangential, the same applies to disabled people. That the courses, the symposiums, the teaching, etc. about disability theology is largely perceived as for those who are disabled or those who have a direct experience of disability, and that is very frustrating.
I think this is what I'm trying to get at with this thing around accepting. Accepting implies, and it still implies, that the norm is able-bodied white men, and probably middle-aged. And the rest of us get to come in on around the edges, and we're the special interest groups. And it's how we how we challenge. I can remember very early on, even before I came to teach in college, getting involved in a discussion around this and trying to argue for the difference between what was in those days, where I'm early 80s now, talking about the difference between feminist theology and theological feminism. And we were trying to, as a group of us, trying to argue that theological feminism was telling the stories, telling the question, just as the norm, as part of the whole thing, rather than you know, you do theology and there's also feminist theology, which is, or there's disability theology, or there's post-colonial theology. But there's norm of theology that everybody does. And it's trying to get at that sort of, no, it's everything's contextual, and that means we need to get every voice in the room on an equal level. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much. It's very good to hear the history. I was one of the first women in 1972 to go to a mixed Cambridge college. I've written my autobiography on that, 30 women, 330 men. This was the good life. A lot of my life, people have asked me, what was it like being the first woman? What was it like being a woman? What was it like? I was a mathematician then. Going to hairdressers and saying that you lecture maths at a university, you get very odd looks. I then became a Baptist minister. You go to the hairdressers and you say, what do you do? And you say, I'm a Baptist minister. And you get odd looks. I'm very struck that it doesn't make much difference being a woman on the whole. There's enormous diversity amongst people. As we said, we have disabled people, we have married people, we have single people, we have people suffering with, well, enjoying all sorts of difficulties. One of my big difficulties in Cambridge was not being an Anglican.
Yeah.
I mean, I noticed that 100 years previously I wouldn't have been able to go to my college because as a free church person I had to be an Anglican. But something I'm wondering about, in the 1960s we used to have a family house near church in the Forest of Dean, where Sister Grace was the pastor, who was a deaconess. I didn't realise all these differences then. She was not married, and I understand that deaconesses were not allowed to be married.
They had to leave the order if they married.
Hmm?
They had to leave the order if they married.
Yes. I know somebody who was a student whose mother wanted to be a deaconess but wasn't allowed for that reason. I wonder, were ministers, female ministers, allowed to be married? Or did that never come up?
Oh, it came up.
Because that's another distinction.
Yeah, it did come up, and some of you will know the name Ruth Matthews. Ruth there was a small group of women came, Ruth and Mary Isaacs, and Carol they were the same kind of generation as Carol. Ruth and Mary both trained at Regent's Park, one after the other. Mary wasn't allowed to live in, but she got sneaked in through the windows at night to get to the library, because the door was locked at 6. Anyway, off point. Ruth was asked, she was unmarried when she started training. She then married a fellow minister. But she was asked in one of her MinRec, she was my senior friend when I started, she was asked in one of her MinRec questions, what will happen if you marry? And she said, I'll be married. But actually, one of my generation, so we're coming down, I candidated for ministry in the 80s. One of my generation, who was single, didn't have a partner at that point, was asked, what will happen if you become pregnant? To which her, I think, brilliant response was, I will have a baby. I was asked, have you ever wanted to be a man? So now I was married, and the other question that was asked of me was, what about your husband's job? To which I have to say my response was, kind of God's called us to be together, and God's called me into ministry and him into his work. I think kind of God's going to have to work this out. And I was told I was very naive. In fact, God was very good, and it worked. But I think, yes, there was an assumption for some of the early women, the women that Maria Living Taylor ministered, who was the same kind of time as Edith Gates, ministered alongside her husband. They were a couple. And for many of the women who were first in ministry, if they were married, they were often married to other ministers, which made it easier and kind of kept it in the domestic model, I think. But I think it has been an issue, and I'm interested that it's still difficult for single women to settle, because my generation, it was for married women. That was the problem. Single women were much easier to settle because they could go anywhere, whereas married women had to be around for their husbands and for schools. And I think, and because they would all have children, of course, that was the assumption. So I think it's almost as if there's always an excuse. Let's make it's difficult for the women because, and it's an excuse that we can't deal with them. Yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Tom, we've got time for one more question. And Jenny, over here, please. And then maybe last comments if you want to make any last comments.
Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a delight to listen to you. I'm really pleased to hear that the college has reached parity. One of the years I was a student here in the early 2000s, whenever it was, I was the only female student that year. I was so glad that Ruth was there. Thank you for some of the comments you've made about Europe. Because that's an issue that's very dear to my heart, is how to encourage women in Europe. I'm thinking Mike Pearce, who many of you know is at IBTSC, they've instigated recently learning networks as a way of educating, and I've talked with him about should we have a course there for women in ministry, because it is a significant issue in Europe. And his idea in the end was, no, that isn't how to go about it. Every course that we do should cover that within it, just as Martin was saying too, in terms of disability. And I just wonder too, you know, what's been the thing that has meant that we have got to parity in Bristol Baptist College? You know, what's happened here, and what might need to happen? How might it pan out in Europe? As you say, how difficult it is there for women to actually be given very many opportunities at all to minister.
Helen says she doesn't know how they got to parity. I know we were agonising about it when I was teaching here, because the numbers were fluctuating. We were small enough that it didn't take much fluctuation for there to be no will. But so I'm thrilled to hear how it is.
I mean, I don't think I've got any clever answers, Jenny. I think it's very helpful. And when I was reflecting with this group of ladies that I mentioned, every single one of whom was blogged, and every single one of whom, or all the ministers in the denomination, in the nation, in the country, are male by definition. And I said, are there any who are supportive? And essentially their message was no. So it's this huge culture shift, and I don't have easy answers to that, but I do think it's got to be men who step up and do this. Because I can shout till I'm blue in the face, and they're not going to pay attention to me by definition. So let's not make this a woman's issue. And the converse of that, actually, just perhaps in the back of something we said a moment ago, is that I think it's really important that women don't just speak about women's things. That's why, you know, I'm a biblical scholar, that's my thing. But let's not make this a women's issue that only women speak about, because we will never shift the culture if that's the case. Well, I don't know how many of you have been into the college building recently, but if you've been at all in the last 20 years, you may well recall that in our dining room, and actually in the lounge downstairs, we've got pictures of all our principals, all of whom share several characteristics, one of which is that they all have a Y chromosome, and that will continue for a little while yet. But we are aware, you know, we don't just want to have pictures of men on our walls, because many people have contributed to the life of the college beyond the male principals. And so we are delighted that for the first step in the direction of perhaps changing the visibility there, we are delighted to unveil today a portrait of Gwyneth Hubble. So to remind you, in case your memory is very short, that she was the first woman to train for the ministry at the Bristol Baptist College. She came in 1937, she left in 1939 with her BD, and she subsequently became principal of Carey Hall College and served the World Council of Churches. So I spoke a few minutes ago about remarkable women. Here's the first at the Bristol Baptist College.